Hi everybody, welcome to part one's lecture on the Florida Redbook. I'm going to give you, in the next I would guess this is probably going to take me about 35-40 minutes, a good basic overview of the differences between one section of the Redbook and the other, and I kind of divided them up really to make this specific and applicable to Florida school finance. I only really pulled stuff that I think is pertinent for you that's specific to this state, because I think you can go through this book, it's not in a book, but you can go through it, you can look at the codes, but the codes are only going to help you when you're actually doing budgeting. I wanted to give you information and facts supported from the Florida Department of Education website and from stuff that I was told by my colleagues is really pertinent to this state, so that you have a good understanding. So I highlighted the important information, and that's what I'm going to focus on for this presentation. So what you need to know, this really is a guide that all districts use for school finance. You're going through this. Not all districts are going to do exactly what is suggested here. They should, but this is an optimal system. This is what all schools should use, and these are the things they need to do to be in regulation. Is that always the case? You know from what you've learned in this class that it's not. Florida is a county system, as we've said a million times, but each district operates autonomously on their own. Most districts will use this as a guide, and that's pretty much going to be, that's what they're going to use it for. But we're going to cover it in here and use what we will, but I'm only going to pull specific things on it. So the question you all care about is really how will you be tested on this. So the only thing that I'm going to hold you accountable for is the stuff that's on the videos and the PowerPoint presentation. Don't use this book, don't use this guide for anything other than a reference tool. What I'll put on the quizzes and what I'll put on the final exam is stuff directly from the PowerPoints, because I just really want this to be a reference tool for building level administration and also for district level administration as well. So chapter 1 really goes over the uniform chart of accounts in the basic manual that's used for financials, cost, and budgetary accounting, in some definitions that are notable for this. The key thing that you need to know is that the most recent revision to Florida financial standards and practices took place in 2009. So we're using a system that's slightly older, but it's really what the financial standards are that each district has to use. My experience, I've seen these change every about 5 to 10 years, so Florida's probably due for another revision coming up soon. Funds, as we've talked about in this class, these are the actual accounts that you're going to be looking at, which are covered in depth in chapter 1. It's just basically a list of accounts. But funds are there to record changes in cash and to carry on specific activities in accordance with regulations, restrictions, or limitations. The fund structure specific to Florida is what's covered on the next slide, and that's really what I want to touch upon. The Florida fund and account structure is divided into government, fiduciary, and proprietary funds. We've talked about all of the governmental funds. We've talked about capital projects. We've talked about permanent funds and debt services funds. We've talked about these in the higher ed component and in the K-12 component. We're going to really go in depth though into fiduciary funds, because I at least want you to have an understanding on the difference between the 4 of these, and I know I have a few questions on the test on those. I think those are important, and I think those are a big deal. The functions for funding is important because most of the other states only use 3. Florida uses 4. Florida has 2 different types of support services. What I'm used to seeing for funding for schools is instruction, support services, and community services. It's an ISC formula. Florida doesn't do that. Florida differentiates between instructional support and general support. So I think that's worth noting because it's different and it's unique for the state compared to what I see in Oklahoma, what I've seen in Ohio. Most of them use instruction, support, and community as their functions. So instruction is easy. I mean, that's the basic function of schools. It's basically I have no idea why it just opened up. There we go. It's the basic K-12, exceptional, current, technical, and adult general education. It's anything that relates to the teaching of students. That's a no-brainer. Pre-kindergarten instruction is Florida specific in instruction. I want you to know that, and I think that is worth noting and considering, because in other states, pre-kindergarten actually goes into community or auxiliary funding. Florida doesn't. It's part of instruction, and that's a big idea, because if you care about early childhood and you know that it's going to be funded out of the instructional funnel, there's more chance of it not getting cut, where we've seen pre-K cut throughout the United States in lots of different locations, big in the Midwest, in Indiana, Illinois. We've seen a lot of the pre-K programs kind of get moved out of district run and district controlled and kind of done in the private sector. But in Florida, pre-K is part of instruction, so I think that's good. So if you support early childhood, pre-K is an acceptable practice, and I think that's important to note. So that's a Florida-specific idea. So instructional support is anything that facilitates and enhances instruction. But this is things like instructional media, curriculum development, staff training. I think the big idea here is that this will normally come out of the district office, and it'll be farmed to each individual building because it's a county system. So your funding for these are going to be determined at the district level, and then it's going to shuffle out and deal to the building levels. And what you end up finding when that happens is that the high schools get the funding first, then it goes to the middle school, then it goes to the elementary schools. But the ISS comes at the district level in most cases, and I think that's an important distinction that's pretty unique to Florida. General support services, this is easy. These are your plant maintenance, food services, transportation, blah, blah, blah. School board fees and salaries are classified in this category as well, which I thought was interesting. I see that normally in the community function, but in the state of Florida, it's part of general support services, so that was interesting. But really, this is the same throughout the United States. There's nothing much to add to this. Community services are common, and they're a big idea in this state. What a lot of people will do with the schools in Florida that have ownership of the building, they'll rent out the gym to a church group, they'll rent out a theater to a senior citizen group. That is a community service and a function of this community, and it's an opportunity for a school, building, or district to even generate more revenue. And that's very common throughout the state. So that's all classified under something called community service. So keep that in mind as well. So debt services and capital outlay exist everywhere. This is, these are your repayments, your loans, the amount of debt that you have. It's how are you going to purchase furniture, how you're going to purchase equipment, how you're going to construct different facilities. But this is common, and this exists everywhere, but it's a part of this whole fund structure, which we've already talked about debt services here. This is a big concept, and this is an important thing to note. Florida uses generally accepted accounting principles, as every single school district pretty much does, and they're monitored by the Governmental Accounting Standards Board. It's common throughout the United States, but the big thing is that the system of accounting they use is called modified accrual basis, and that is a big idea. So if a revenue is earned, meaning the district acquires it, so go back to that church group rental we were talking about. So the district enters a contract with a local church to use the gym for services on Sundays because it's not going to be used. As soon as that revenue is earned and received, that revenue is reported. That's the modified accrual basis of accounting, and that's a big idea because that contributes to the fund balance. It's not saved until the end of a period, it's reported immediately. So big idea here, big specific Florida practice that I think you need to know. So chapter 2, I'm going to go over some of the balance sheet accounts that are also sort of worth mentioning. More than anything else, really, the next slide is the one that I think is the big idea. You have to know, as a building principal, what the 6 different types of accounts are that are going to be looked upon looked upon as you as a building principal. So the first one is this notion of cash on demand. So these are deposits that are made for any normal expenditures. The district needs to acquire furniture, they need to acquire new textbooks, something like that. that will normally come from cash on demand. Petty cash I'm going to talk about in depth on the next slide, but that's your small obligations where you don't need a check. Cash change funds is existent probably in high schools. This is if you have like one of those little bags that has change on hand that can actually change your cash register. If you're using funds to purchase student lunches, if there's stuff that the building is selling, pencils, equipment, things like that, cash change funds are normally used for that, and it's just cash on hand. It's kept in a separate account. Anything that's with a commercial bank, that's considered with a fiscal service agent. The interest earning deposits, this is if you have money that's in a fund balance, you have money that's left over, and you say, hey, I know we're not going to spend it this year, so we're going to put it in a CD, we're going to put it in a savings account so they can accrue interest, then that goes into a separate account than cash with fiscal service agents, because you're doing it for the purpose of acquiring interest, so that's kind of different. Cash on hand, this is just stuff that's physically in hand that you haven't put and classified into one of these categories, and it hasn't been deposited yet. So, petty cash is easily stolen by individuals at school districts. It is very easy for anybody in the building to slip a 20 into their pocket, and nobody will know the difference of where it comes from. You might think in your mind right now, well, 20 is 20, but let's say that, building personnel, whoever it may be, secretary, teacher, custodian, even a student who's in charge of it, they slip a 20 every week for 10 weeks, then it starts adding up. You're up to $200, they keep doing it. Petty cash gets stolen very easily, and people don't track it, they don't have much control of it. I advise you to have a check and balance system. Different buildings, one of the parts of the research that I was doing in Florida, I asked about finance questions. I said, what's your petty cash balance? We had a small elementary school, said $50, and then one of the high schools, I forget which one, but they said $750. So that's a lot of money for petty cash. So it's radically different depending on the district and the building size, so keep that in mind too. This is important for Florida because this is a Florida Department of Education classification. We believe in this notion of accumulated depreciation. A life cycle, when you depreciate something, for computer hardware, it's how it's purchased and how it's classified and the value of it. In Florida, they believe that any computer is a 5-year cycle. I would argue differently. I'm a Mac person. I've had my Mac laptop now for 7 or 8 years. I've worked at institutions that use Macs, and some are 8 or 9 years old and they're functioning fine. But in Florida, we cycle out hardware and we depreciate computer hardware over 5 years. So if the value of a computer is $1,000, at the end of year 1, it's still a $1,000 value. At the end of year 2, it has an $800 value. In year 3, it's $600 value. Year 4, $400. Year 5, $200. By year 6, it has no more value in useful life. So what that means is if it continues on past its useful life, then you're actually getting value from it according to the Department of Education. If you sell it to another school, so you're in a wealthier school, and then you funnel it to a different school system, then you make a revenue from it. It's already been depreciated, so it's off the books, and anything that comes in is pure revenue. So this is important. Florida computer hardware is 5 years, and it's accumulated depreciation. It's not residual value, it's not useful life, it's a 5-year expense. So this, I thought, was also interesting too, because computer software is 2 different classifications in this state. It's system software and it's application programs. When I say system software, I'm talking about operating systems and programming languages. So that would be the interface that you're using on a PC, which is Windows, or the interface you're using on a Mac. So that's different than application programs. Application programs are like your Microsoft Word, your Microsoft Excel, that sort of thing. If you have to run a software programming language, I was a computer science teacher, and we used Java, and we had to use the installer for Java. That would count under system software. But the big idea behind this is if the software comes pre-equipped with the computer, so when you open up a new Dell or a new Compaq and you see, wow, it comes equipped with Windows 10, that's a separate cost. It's recorded with the equipment. as is. So it's not a software cost, but if you take that license and you transfer it from one computer to another, then it has to be removed and detached and allocated to a software account. So that's slightly different in this state as well, but it's also different because we classify it as two different types of assets. So I thought that was interesting as well. So when you consume new assets for a future reporting period, if you have debt, you can reclassify it and you can call it new debt. That's also unique in Florida because we have weird interest rates in this state. I mean, you don't need me to tell you this, but your values of house and your value of interest rates in here have been crazy for the last 15 years. Right now, they're really good. If 2 years from now, I'm going to be looking at this and saying, wow, these interest rates are horrible. 5 years ago, they were awful in Florida. 10 years ago, they were great in Florida. So this is significant. So if a district takes those risks, which, it is a risk here because the interest rate might get better next year, it might get worse. When you refinance, it becomes new debt, and it's not old debt. So you refinance and reclassify it. So chapter 3 is long, but I picked out things that were Florida specific because that might be something that, once again, could interest you and could help you develop your paper better. So the federal impact funds are a big deal in any system in the United States because you want to receive federal money. But in this state, we don't have much money that comes from federal support. In 2014, only 12.7% of the money that came into Florida came from federal support. Everything came state and local in the state. But the federal money that did come in, as long as 3% of the total average daily attendance comes from people who own property in Florida or their parent, the student's parent has it, then you're eligible for federal impact funds. That's all that's required. So obviously, almost every single account, you can easily get 3% of the population, unless you're in a really, really, really tiny district. But the majority of money in the revenue for Florida is locally and state generated, so that's slightly different. So keep that in mind, but I do want to note that that's how federal impact funds are determined in this state. So this is important. Workforce Investment Act is big in the state of Florida because there really is a high priority on technical programs, career and technical education, which I think is awesome. We don't get this in every state. Where I'm from in Pennsylvania, career and technical education really was passed aside in favor of your traditional academic rigor, but I think we need technology programs and apprenticeship programs, and I think they need to be built, and I think they need to be stronger, and I think that's important. So, when you're assessing tuition, for adult general education programs, a block tuition of $45 per half year or $30 per term shall be assessed. And that money is given to fund these adult general education programs. Obviously, that's not exactly much, but it's enough to at least provide additional support specific for adult education programs. To go back to what I want to state is that state funds can no longer be spent on continuing workforce education as of 2014. That was a change, and that's kind of changed how we address funding issues in the state for career and technical school and workforce. So districts can collect a technology fee if they want to, and if that's a part of the program, which, in all of your programs, there's going to be a technology fee, so that shouldn't come as a surprise. It can't exceed 5% of the tuition per credit hour for resident students, for people that are living in state. But you can also do the same 5% for out of state as well. And this can be something that can reinvest into technology, but it has to go to technology that goes to benefit schools that are benefiting from the Workforce Investment Act. So that's important too. It can't exceed 5% of the tuition per credit hour. So state funds, the Florida Education Finance Program is where the majority of the state funds is distributed. Then they can allocate the money as they want. If you're reading through this